All right. So the topic for this conference was escape, and I thought this was really well suited for me to talk about travel because this has been a big part of my life, and I got into history podcasting through travel, not the other way around. So I want to give a little bit about myself because my background is a bit different. I started back in 2007. I sold my house and I wanted to travel around the world for a year. And I ended up traveling for about a decade. And it was up until about 2016 that I finally got an apartment. But even after that, before the pandemic, I was still traveling for about a third to a half of every year. And so far, I've been to 203 different countries and territories around the world. That gets into a big thing about, what's the definition of a country, but you can kind of see by the map that I've been to a whole lot of places, including a lot of the little tiny countries and islands, like every country in the Pacific, pretty much every country in the Caribbean, countries in West Africa, Central Asia, things like that. I've been to all 7 continents. I actually did it once in a 9-month period. I'm a pretty accomplished travel photographer. I've been named Travel Photographer of the Year 3 times in North America. And all of the photos used in this presentation are ones that I took. And more importantly, for the purposes of what I'm going to be talking about, I've been to 403 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So that's about a third of them on Earth. There's about a little under 1,200 right now. And I've also been to 220 National Park Service sites in the United States, which is about half of the total sites. And that includes national monuments, battlefields, historic sites, as well as the main parks themselves. And to get into this, there's a couple ways I thought about dividing up this topic. And so I'm going to divide it into 4 sort of things. And my podcast, most of the people that do shows who are talking here pick a topic and then they go real deep on that topic. And my show is just the opposite. I'm like a shotgun. Every day, I do a different episode every day, and it's all over the place. It's very eclectic, different points of history, different places, different stories. And so this presentation is going to be kind of the same way to give you examples of some of the things and some of the reasons why you might want to consider traveling to augment what you know about history. And those are establishing personal bonds with history. A lot of times when we read about history or we hear about it, it's just something in a book. It's just numbers. It's just dates. We don't necessarily bond with the people or what life might have been like. And that really changes when you actually go and see these places yourself. Second is creating emotional ties. And this, I think, is going to become kind of evident when I go through that. There are lots of tiny details that are completely glossed over in books that never would bother to get mentioned because they're talking about wars and kings and things like that. But there's small details that you'll only notice if you actually go to a place. And you can only do that if you're going to be traveling. And finally, creating connections with the modern world, because history is never really done. And there are things that happened 2,500 years ago that are still affecting events today. So this is a pretty well-known quote, that the world is a book and those who do not travel read only a page. And in particular, I thought it was important because this photo I took in Gibraltar, Ethiopia. And this book is, man, it has to be at least 500 years old. And it's an Ethiopian Coptic text that they brought out for me to look at. And I thought it really kind of hammers the point home. And just the time I spent in Ethiopia was really eye-opening because the Ethiopian Coptic Church is a very ancient church. And a lot of their traditions and customs go back a very long time. It's one of the earliest churches in all personalized history and how we can get a personal feel for a lot of what happened in the past. This building is in Hebron, Labrador. It's in the northernmost part of Labrador. Hardly anybody goes there. And in the 1950s, it was a community run by a church that was for the local Inuit population. And in 1959, the Labradoran government, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, unilaterally decided to remove all of the people that lived in this community. They had no say in it. They weren't even notified until it happened. And they were forcibly removed. And to this day, a lot of the people who were removed continued to go back to Hebron. Now, when I visited, I actually visited with some of the descendants of the people who were forcibly removed from Hebron. And one of the things that you'll notice in this photo is a picture hanging on the wall. This building is pretty dilapidated. I wouldn't be surprised if it collapsed in a few years. But this photo was put there by the grandmother of the woman I was there visiting. And her grandmother lived in this home. And it wasn't some historical relic like it would have been to me if I had been there by myself. She hung this photo there to remain until the house fell down, because she wanted to make sure that their family had their presence, known in this house until the house was no more. And had I not been with these people who were the descendants of the people who lived there, it would have been a completely different experience. I never even would have known to ask about that. And it was really eye-opening being with those people. And there was also a cemetery there as well. And one of the women who was kind of the tour guide, she had her young son, and they visited the cemetery where her grandmother was, which is a lot of the people who were removed asked to remain and be buried in Hebron. And it was a really moving experience. One of the questions you always get about history is, what did people do on their daily life for taking care of business? And as you can see, this is a latrine. This is from Ostia Antica, which is about 45 minutes outside of Rome. This used to be the port city for Rome. And today, it's actually about 2 kilometers from the sea because of silting. But Ostia Antica is a place that a lot of people don't know about, and it's extremely well preserved. I would maybe not quite as much as Pompeii, but it's very well preserved. And you can very clearly see how the people took care of their business. And again, this is something that, historians in Rome weren't necessarily going to write about, but it's there in the artifacts. And if you're just reading the history of the emperors and the history of the empire, a lot of these things are going to be totally missed. For example, if you go to places like Pompeii or Herculaneum, you'll see they were the equivalent of fast food places where they had soup that they may have sold, or they had amphorae with wine or olive oil. And all those things are still there. And you can see what day-to-day life was like. And I'll be mentioning something later on that also is a detail that you completely miss unless you actually go to these places to look at it. This is where Napoleon lived on the island of St. Helena. This is Longwood. This is the place where he died and was exiled. It's very hard to get to St. Helena. And so when most people know, the only thing they know about St. Helena is the fact that Napoleon was exiled there. I had to take a boat from Cape Town, and it was a 5-day journey to get to St. Helena. Then I was stuck on the island for 10 days before I could get the next boat to go back to Cape Town. So all in all, it was like a 20-day trip to get to St. Helena. They have an airport now, so it's much easier. And the process of taking that journey, which would have been even worse for Napoleon, really hammered home how remote his exile was. That, once he was here, he was never, ever going to leave. And then there are other spots on the island as well that deal with the history of Napoleon. And today, this is actually owned by the French government. There's someone on the island who works for the French government. He's basically lived there since the late 80s. He's probably going to live there the rest of his life. But it's something that you don't really get just reading the history books, and something I didn't realize until I got there, just how remote St. Helena was. And there was also the other thing that struck me is everything I had read about Napoleon's exile in St. Helena talked about, the weather conditions were bad. It was so damp. And when I was there, that was not the case at all. It was actually quite sunny. It's a tropical, it's in the tropics. The weather was actually very good. So a lot of the locals said, well, it's not always like that. And I'm sure that's true, but it also put that into perspective. And finally, this was from Pompeii. And I'm sure you all know the story about how when Mount Vesuvius erupted, it actually buried so many of the people that were there, and it actually put their bodies into casts. And you can actually go and see a lot of these people as they were found. And you can actually see for some of them, you can actually see the expression on their faces. You can still see their teeth and a lot of the non-organic material that was still there. And this really brings it home as far as the fact that this isn't just ancient old stuff, which is the impression you get when you visit a lot of places. This is actually something that these are real people. And when you see all the other stuff in Pompeii, it really brings it home. One of the interesting things I found in Pompeii is how open things like brothels were. And that they had, if you go to where the brothel section was in Pompeii, they had erotic artwork. There were carved phalluses in stone, like this way to the brothel. And it was all rather open. And again, it gives you a sort of an indication of as to what the culture was like in ancient Rome. Establishing emotional ties. There are a lot of things in history that are very heavy and, very important, and it's easy to gloss over them, that, they just become a number, this many casualties or this many fatalities or this happened. But until you actually get somewhere and see it for yourself, it doesn't necessarily sink in. One of the presenters earlier was talking about the Shackleton expedition. This was part of a hike I took on South Georgia Island, where we retraced part of the steps that Shackleton took when he actually walked over South Georgia to get to Stromness, which was the whaling station where he eventually found help. We didn't do the whole thing, of course. We just did a small part of it. But even doing a small part of it gives you a personal sense of just how difficult Shackleton's voyage was. And having been on the island, it is absolutely remote and desolate, and there's nothing there. And for him to do this, it's an even more impressive accomplishment. Plus, of course, Shackleton and his right-hand man are also buried at Grytviken, which is the capital, quote unquote, of South Georgia. Not that anyone really lives there. But it really hammered the point home once you're done with this really exhaustive trek that, wow. And he did way, way more than that. We just did a very small hike. There are several of these places in West Africa. This is in Gori Island, Senegal, one of the very first World Heritage Sites. It's called the Door of No Return. And there's several doors. And these were basically where slaves were put onto ships. And this was the last door that they ever exited in Africa before they were sent somewhere in the New World. And these are very emotional things to actually see. There's another one that we saw in Ghana, in Cape Coast, one of the castles there, as well as in Togo as well. And in fact, there's actually a big monument in Lomé, the capital of Togo, where they have a representation of a door to nowhere, or the last door. You probably all know where this is. And again, I think when you talk about the Holocaust, it can often just become, numbers, or, the Nazis did this. And it's not until you actually go to a concentration camp where you can have a true visceral impact. And there were a lot of other photos I chose not to use where you see like the shoes or the hair of the actual prisoners who were there and were killed. And it's so monumental that you have a very hard time processing it. But it means so much more to actually see this yourself than to just get the facts and figures as you do from history. And one of the things that's good is that as history advances, as we get further away from events, we're at a point now where most of the Holocaust survivors are quite old, and there are fewer of them every year, as with World War II veterans. And eventually there will be a day where there won't be any. But we'll still have these places where people can go to remember it. And that's not the case for other tragedies which happened in the past, where they didn't preserve these sort of things. And I think if you ever have the chance, if you're ever in Krakow, this has to be, one of your stops, if not one of the first ones that you make. And even within the United States, as I visited a lot of National Park Service sites, this is a real important one because they've preserved the building where the whole Brown versus Board of Education started, and they preserved it as it was in the 1950s with segregated fountains, segregated restrooms, so you can actually see yourself what the experience was like, and there are rangers that will take you around. The next thing I want to get into are the small details that you can see when you actually go to experience this yourself. So this is Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the statues of Ramses. That's not what I want to show you. What I want to show you is this. the graffiti, 19th century graffiti. And you'll find this stuff all over. And it's not spoken about that much. You'll find this inside the Great Pyramid. You will find this in a lot of places. And graffiti is something that doesn't get a lot of attention, but even there's ancient graffiti in places like Pompeii and other places where you can see what the locals and the regular people were saying, what their idea of an insult was, and even how they use the language. The Roman vernacular, or I should say vulgar Roman, which ended up developing into the Romance languages, it's a way for linguistics to see a lot of this. And I'm not certainly advocating people deface, ancient works. That's not a good thing, but it is something you can see. And the weird thing I always found about this as well is you also notice they did their graffiti with a serif font in the 19th century. And I've seen this too, all over the world. Wherever there were British, they kind of had to carve their name in it. This is the Arch of Titus in Rome. And this is a detail this is a menorah, you'll notice. And this is from the triumph after they conquered Jerusalem and basically tore down the Second Temple. And this was brought back. It was a gold menorah. And this is still, immortalized on the Arch of Titus. And it's really fascinating that this was part of it. And just as a bookend of this was taken in Israel at Masada. So Masada was part of the Great Jewish Revolt, which was from the slide before that resulted in the conquest of Jerusalem. The last stand of the rebels were in Masada. It was a mountain stronghold, and the Romans basically built a giant ramp until they eventually stormed it. Well, the Romans created these squares, which is where they had their camps, and they were fortified. This is right near the Dead Sea. And so everything down here basically lasts forever. And that is the Roman encampment. And that's something that would normally never exist. Like if they were in Germany or Gaul, they would, build their encampment out of dirt and eventually it would erode down. But near the Dead Sea, that's still there. And I thought that was one of the most fascinating parts of visiting Masada. And Easter Island, if you ever get a chance to go, you've probably all seen the pictures of the Moai. They're very, everyone knows about them. One of the things that stunned me, having gone there, is the fact that once you've been there, every picture I see now of Easter Island, I know where that's from because there actually aren't many of them. And once you've been there, you realize, well, okay, that was taken. This is taken near the volcano. This one is taken over near Tongariki. And you know where they are because there's only a handful of them, and everyone's taking pictures of the exact same thing. And finally, I want to make some modern connections because there are things, like I said, from history that still connect to our world today. So such as this is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And if you go to if you've been paying attention to the news, this was a Byzantine cathedral. Then it became a mosque after the Ottomans took it over. And then after the Kemal Ataturk took control of the country, he secularized it. He turned it into a museum. And then just within the last year, it's been turned back into a mosque that people can visit. So even 1,500 years after this building having been built, it's still being fought over. There's still debates surrounding it. And this is actually one of my favorite buildings in the world. The story behind it is absolutely fascinating. It was one of the largest buildings in the world for about 1,000 years. And incredibly enough, when you look at the history of cathedrals, say in Europe, where it took them centuries to build some of them, this was built in 5 years, which was absolutely astounding. This I took in Bethlehem, just in the West Bank, and this is some Banksy art. There's actually several Banksy projects that you can find. And, here too, everything that's been going on in the Middle East, it's still there. And I've had a front row seat to a whole bunch of things. I was in East Timor the day the president and the prime minister both had assassination attempts on them. I've been in the middle of massive protests in Thailand and a bunch of things. And the process of getting to and from the West Bank, it's actually not hard, but boy, there's a lot of checkpoints and, danger signs and everything else. I had no problem. It was a very pleasant experience actually. But when you're there and you see the border walls and all the guards and security, everything that's going on in the Middle East right now is really hammered home when you see it yourself. These two men are in Nijmegen, Netherlands. And what they do is, if you've ever seen the movie A Bridge Too Far, there's a scene where Robert Redford takes a bunch of American soldiers and they have to take a bridge, and they're in these canvas boats and they're using the butts of their guns as oars. And they got to get across and take the other side of the bridge from the Nazis. And in the process, 48 Americans died. About 10 years ago, the city of Nijmegen wants to build a new bridge. And what they do is they put 48 sets of lights across the bridge. And every single day since the bridge is opened, over a decade now, there are 2 veterans who walk across the bridge at sunset every single day. And one day I was in Nijmegen and I got to join them. And I got to visit them, and anyone is welcome to take part in it. But this is a remembrance of what happened back in World War II. And it's also to honor veterans really from all countries and all wars. These were actually men who were Dutch, and they fought or they served as peacekeepers in Bosnia back in the 90s. And just to prove that history never really ends, this was taken in Skopje in North Macedonia, as it's now called. And they have 2 enormous statues, one of Alexander the Great and one of his father, King Philip. And this has caused huge problems between themselves and Greece, because there has been debate over who owns the legacy of Alexander the Great. And the agreement they finally came to, so if you may remember, there was a great deal of debate about the name of the country. So after Yugoslavia fell apart, Macedonia had to call themselves the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which was their name in the United Nations. And they finally have come to an agreement with Greece, whereby they will call themselves North Macedonia to distinguish themselves from the Greek province of Macedonia. And they have agreed to take down these massive gaudy statues because the Greeks want to claim the legacy of Alexander. And the Macedonians are actually part of the Slavic migration that came south. And so they're technically not Macedonians in the same way Alexander was. And that was a big to-do. And the one thing I wanted to kind of leave you with was, I know a lot of the people here are history podcasters. And whenever you talk about the business of podcasting, monetization always comes up. And one of the best ways I found is to run tours. That whatever your subject is about, it's associated with some place where those events happened. And running a tour is actually a really good way to make money. I've run several tours in the past before I got into podcasting, because I run a travel website, and those I've run, I think, 5 of them now in different continents. I've done them in Africa, Europe, South America, North America. And it's actually a pretty good way to make money. And now that I've done my podcast, I'm going to be doing some deep dive tours. I've announced Rome, Jerusalem, and Istanbul, and I've had several hundred people who have shown interest in it. And you only need, half a dozen in order to, make it worth your while, and actually to have it be a pretty fun experience, because you can go out and kind of sort of be a tour guide, and just depending on how you do it. So I think that's the time they gave me for the presentation itself. And if anyone has any questions, and if Eugene, you want to come back, that's fine. No, I started my history podcast due to the pandemic, because basically the whole travel industry disappeared. The tours I did in the past are more about photography and just traveling in general. But I've had more interest for a history-based tour than I have for pretty much anything else, just to put that into perspective. And I know some other podcasts that have done it too, where they've done like trips to Italy and other places. No clue. I have no trips planned. Right now, my focus is on the show. I've done a lot of traveling, so this is an opportunity for me to sort of do something else for a while. I'll be traveling again, and probably traveling a lot, I'm sure. And I may even actually go move somewhere for a while and just work there. There's been a lot of opportunities for remote work. So if you're a remote worker, there's a bunch of countries. I know Georgia, Barbados, Estonia, a bunch of places now will give you a 1-year visa if you work remotely, and you can just go get a cheap apartment or something and just stay there for a year and work and then make side trips or whatever. I haven't, but I could totally see how it could happen. I've been to Cyprus. I was in Cyprus a few years ago, and a couple of employees I had for my old company were Cypriots, and I got to hang out with them, and they were sort of my tour guides. So we went to a lot of the Roman ruins that were there, some of the very small Orthodox churches that are up in the mountains. That was really great. I went over to North Cyprus just briefly, but there's probably a lot more to see there. And yeah, I certainly, there's a lot of history on Cyprus. It goes back, it's pretty deep. I haven't particularly planned anything yet. Um, I don't know what by virtual tour guide you kind of mean. Um, like you just show people photos. Uh, I always think that it's such a better experience actually going somewhere than what you're ever going to get. And oh, so you're physically there. Yeah, that would be kind of interesting. I think there's certainly probably demand for that. If you look at what's popular on like Twitch, or even like, Instagram live feeds, those sort of things have done really well. I remember this was a long time ago. I was in Bangkok and I ordered a meal at a restaurant and I was bored. So I set up my laptop and I did a live stream of me eating hot pot. And this is like 10 years ago, before a lot of these streaming services were available. And I think I had like 500 people watching me eat. Uh, I, I think there might be a market for it. The problem is if you're in one place and you're kind of doing the same thing over and over, there might be burnout in that. And a better approach might be to just record something, because Rick Steves does that. He's created a line of like audiobooks or audio guides where if you're going into a cathedral, he'll say, okay, we're at the front door of the cathedral. Now look to your left and you can see this, this, and this. And so that kind of tour where somebody can just download would probably have a lot more success, because it's not necessarily dependent upon them and you being there at exactly the same time. To-do list more than a bucket list. I'm very close to visiting all 63 national parks in the US. I would have finished it last year. I've been to the hard ones. I've been to American Samoa and all the Alaska parks. The ones I have to visit are like California, Texas, West Virginia, and the Virgin Islands. So I want to do that. I've been working on visiting all the national parks in Canada, which is, I'm pretty much close to visiting all the ones in the provinces. All I have to is like Ontario and two in Quebec, and those are easy, super easy to get to. But the ones north of the Arctic Circle are extremely difficult to get to in Canada, especially one that's near the tip of Ellesmere Island, which is the northernmost point in Canada. I've mapped that out. There's a bunch of other things. I've never been to Peru, no particular reason. There's a lot of Russia and China I have yet to explore because there's such big places. I want to return to the Pacific. That's really one of my favorite parts of the world, and re-photograph a lot of that, because that was where I first began my travels back in 2007. And I want to go back and see what's changed and photograph that again. And there's also a bunch of other little things as well. As I've been doing my show, there's a whole bunch of things. And the reason I'm doing a tour in Rome is we're going to do a deep dive tour. So normally you go on a tour and it's like, we spend 2 days in Rome, 2 days in Florence, 2 days in, it's that kind of thing. And I want to do like, okay, we're going to spend 10 days in Rome and we're going to see all the stuff that nobody gets to see. And one of the things I really want to see is the Scavi, which is the crypt under the Vatican. Not the grotto where anybody can go down and like John Paul II's buried there, but this is where the original St. Peter's was built, and it's the Roman cemetery where St. Peter was buried. And they excavated and found all this stuff right after World War II. And you can only go down there by appointment. There's no photographs allowed, and it's only done in really small groups. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff I want to do. Even, you can't just go to a country and say, oh, I've been to that country. Um, there's so much in every country that there's always more to see. The only time I can say I've really done that is I basically followed it's called the Liberation Route, which is the route the Allies took in World War II. So I started in southern England in Plymouth, and then I took the ferry over to Normandy, and then I visited the D-Day beaches, and then from there I worked my way up into Belgium and the Netherlands, and then into Germany, and then I wound up in Berlin. And I visited a lot of the war cemeteries, the battlefields, um, the museums along the way, because that's actually, if you actually want to see like even American military equipment, the best place to see it from World War II is in Europe, because we brought all that stuff over there. We never took it home. So there's actually fantastic museums like in Bastogne, um, some really good ones in the Netherlands as well. To be completely honest, unless if it's something special like going to a really remote place like that, that requires planning. I usually don't plan anything at all. I just show up. I very frequently will go to a place and not even have a hotel room, and I'll just like whip out my phone. Having a smartphone is like cheating when it comes to travel because it makes it so simple. Uh, and I'll pull up just get some cheap hotel room, and just kind of figure it out as I go along. I've done it so many times that it's kind of second nature to me. And I think a lot of people have a fear of traveling, and a lot of that fear comes from the unknown. And so they tend to overplan. And one of the things I realized really early on is that planning can actually be the enemy, that you want to remain flexible, because especially if it's a longer trip, you're going to meet people who were just where you were going. They're going in the opposite direction, and they're going to give you on the ground tips of like, oh yeah, we just saw this and this is open and this is closed. So having that flexibility, I've always found to make for a much better experience. Yes. Uh, it backfired in Tokyo. I was there. So the Japanese have a holiday like Thanksgiving, and I was in Tokyo, and the room I was at a hostel was running out, and I tried to renew it for another few days. And they're like, "Oh, we can't do that. We're full." And then I went online, and like everything was full. Like the only thing that was available were like rooms that were over $1,000, and I ended up having to stay in a capsule hotel, which is the place where normally drunk businessmen stay overnight. And it was an experience. I'm glad I did it. I'm not sure I necessarily want to do it again, but uh, yeah, it was. That's what I ended up having to do. So, and for major cities like in London, I've figured out now that I'm always almost better off staying somewhere near Heathrow because it's cheaper than it is trying to stay in central London. And if you just take like the Hammersmith to London and stay at something out near the airport, yeah, maybe you're tacking on 45 minutes, but you're going to save a ton of money. And the odds are that something near the airport is probably going to be available, whereas something in central London might not. Uh, I'm because I'm pretty well known as I mean, I was a travel photographer until the pandemic hit, and I basically all my income pretty much disappeared. So a lot of it would be based on working with projects for different destinations or different tour companies. So I would go on a tour with them or something to help promote it. So a lot of it's based on what opportunities arise. And then from there, it's usually based on, well, have I been there before? Is there something cool to see? That kind of stuff, which is another reason I have nothing planned right now. Oh, sure. In fact, I'd like to go back to a lot more places, but I just haven't had the opportunity yet. And there's always, depending on the place, like London, every time I go, I visit a different part of the city. And it's like visiting a completely different city every time. There's so much there. A lot of major cities. And there's a major travel industry event that's always held in London in the fall of the year. And what I would do when I went normally is I'd fly into London, go to the event, and then I would go to some other part of England. So, I'd go to Cornwall one year, I'd go to Liverpool or whatever, or I'd go to Canterbury and just kind of make these trips, because traveling in England's pretty easy if you travel by train. So it's something very easy to do. I usually travel alone. When I announced to everyone, oh, I'm going to travel around the world, everyone's like, oh, we have to come meet you on the road. And then no one did ever. So, I mean, I didn't want to wait for someone else. And so I just did it on my own. I have traveled with other people before, friends of mine, but they were friends I got from the world of travel. So they were already well-traveled people. And we were just like, yeah, well, I was thinking of going there. I'm going there too. So let's go do it together. So that's how it worked out. Going to South Georgia Island was one of them. Most people, if they go to Antarctica, they just go right to Antarctica. But every year, the ships that go there will usually take one trip, at least one, to South Georgia Island and the Falklands. And that was an amazing experience, because there's way more penguins there than there are in Antarctica, because there's land. So when they lay their eggs and stuff, they can actually do it. And those subantarctic islands all the way around Antarctica is where most of the penguin breeding happens. And walking onto a beach with 250,000 penguins is an amazing experience. And there, believe it or not, there's a fair amount of history there as well. Like, even when you go to the Antarctic Peninsula, there used to be whaling stations there, and you can still see the ships and even oil drums and stuff like that that are still in those places. And the history of Antarctica is not actually that long, because humans didn't even know about it until about, I think 250 years ago. But yeah, there's even history there that you can find. So I always say South Georgia, because it's great, but there's a lot of, I like Jordan, Oman, Japan, and a lot of your experience are based on, the weather, the people you meet, and stuff like that. And oh yeah, about the penguin colonies, they smell horrible, because it's all penguin poop and dead birds, and it's really loud too, because they're all squawking and they have no fear of humans. So they'll walk right up to you and check you out. They're not going to like flee when you're there. No, they just curious. You're just a thing that they check out. So, the two things that usually intimidate most people are language and a fear of crime. Fear of crime is really overblown. We tend to have negative views of most places because that's all we hear about in the news. And so, if you ask most people what you think of Colombia, drug lords come to mind. And that really hasn't been a thing since the 80s. But nothing has really replaced it in people's consciousness. So that's what they still think. And with language, just, I don't know, go to England if that's, you'll feel comfortable doing that. You can get around. Actually, most places in Northern Europe, people speak English better than Americans do, to be honest. You can go anywhere in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, even most of Germany, and you can get by just fine. Or if you want to go a place like Asia, go to Singapore. Singapore is a fantastic city, one of the safest in the world. And English is widely spoken as the business language. That's what everyone uses. So that'd be another good place to go. Malaysia is the same. You can get by pretty much everywhere in Malaysia. I can for a while, or you can always reach out to me. I'm super easy to find online. You can do it on Twitter or whatever. I'm really the only person with this name, so sure. Thanks.